Alrighty. Alrighty, this is Jonathan Albin, Nycos D&D, Nycos Insider. Hey folks, this is a new start of a new week and our second episode of this series. I probably won't keep track of them as efficiently verbally, but it'll definitely be up there. You notice a couple of changes to the page, including the fact that I can actually put the title of the event up there for you to be able to see instead of me using my little card counter thing that I was using before. So, if you notice, I'll be looking off to my, to your way of looking at it, it's looking to my left, but it's looking to my stage right to look at my monitor from time to time to see whether or not there's any questions from you as we go into this. Nycos, as a game world, has a considerably long history in real time and in fictional time. I started, as I mentioned last time, when I was 11 years old in 1974, and I've been pretty much nonstop a game player and storyteller for the duration of that entire time. And the sessions vary in intensity from whimsical slapstick or just silly romps, such as my annual Wally adventures and my seasonal holiday events, all the way to very dark, very dire storylines concerning the very nature of existence and the very identity of what time is. With all of that, of course, there is a whole world to populate, and while you may have seen the map before, I wanted to give you a chance to look at least for a second or two, the map of Nycos, my game world. And while the look at the map doesn't tell nearly enough about it, suffice it to say there's over 150 different defined countries, plus many areas that are wastelands and open frontiers. The variety, therefore, of cultures and peoples that are potentially run into by a games group are rather extensive. And so the concept of utilizing sects and secret societies and cults and such are pretty much a requirement when you are talking about populations in excess of a couple thousand. I mean, people, even in small towns, as I can attest to some of the various places I've lived in my life, tend to be fairly insular and self-protective, but at the same time they tend to be a bit on the secretive side, and there's plenty of gossip to go around. So on the larger scale, in larger population centers, those gossips and busybodies end up being informants and information gatherers for the larger and more malevolent organizations that might use that information. So I will be breaking these down into the 3 different categories, and we'll be talking about each one separately. We're going to start with the one that sounds rowdiest. That's the sects. A sect, by definition, is a isolated group of individuals who share either a common religion, a common philosophy, or a common faith. And these sects can be as benign as being collectors of, say, seashells, or they might be those that have been awake at the beginning of each day for more than 365 days, or whatever, and these various requirements or limitations of the sects as they form set up the regimentation necessary for them to be identified collectively. So, for example, in Eldrasar, there are the group that during the early days of the campaign were worshippers of Kord, the deity, as the world was slowly splintering and tearing itself apart culturally, and the ones that to this day now actually are the physical followers of Kord, the character who happens to be a high enough level to be fundamentally a general, commander, or if he wanted it, perhaps even king. These sects, therefore, tend to be on the lawful side. It's awfully hard to hold a group together, especially in the small and secretive ways, if they're chaotic, because one or two or actually all of them will or may or more than likely will eventually betray the whole. So groups like that therefore don't last or don't stick together very long. So sects by nature tend to be a bit on the lawful side. So for that reason, for example, in Nycos, there are sects that are loyal to the various veils. But the ironic ones would be, for example, it's very rare that you would find even an isolated sect of the Yellow Veil, simply because the Yellow Veil people can't hold their own attention long enough to specify a specific course of action like a sect would be required to do. So consider the sects, therefore, even if they are of the veils, to be on the lawful side of the line, even in cases where it might not seem as logical. Sects hold their groups together most of the time on the basis of reaching a particular objective within a particular time. They aren't necessarily long in duration chronologically, with the possible exception of some of the Purple Veil sects who see time differently. But holding on to a group or keeping a group going in terms of a sect usually is aligned with a specific objective. Overthrowing a government that's too oppressive, for example, in the case of a sect that forms within a Red Veil area, simply to overthrow their controllers. Or perhaps in a place where various sacrifices are occurring and they want to stop those, the various groups might build a sect for Genera or Viridian, or actually possibly, and in some cases both. So a sect by definition is of a religious order, generally short in duration and usually with a primary objective, and once those have been accomplished, the sect usually falls into disinterest or non-use. While there will be those, of course, that hold to the old ways, much like in the actual world today. There are groups like the Amish or the old order people who wear cult clothing from a previous period and hold to rituals and concepts that fall into those older times simply because they've done it for so long. Beyond the sects, also, then you have to look at, in particular, the idea of cults. And a cult, quite frankly, can follow such a wide-ranging area of operation that it's kind of hard to quantify. For my purposes and for Nycos, I generally hold to the following tenets for a cult to exist. And a lot of these rules, if you will, for what a cult is, follow the moral standpoint, I guess you would say, of religious people today. A cult, by definition, therefore, is an organization that has a mortal or at least living leader. And when I say mortal or at least living, in Nycos, of course, there are some beings that have lifespans that defy human understanding. Some of them have lived for literally more than one iteration, and there are those whose existence simply doesn't apply in terms of physical life, and yet they may be the source of a cult. Cults are often drawn by a person's charisma, their ability to communicate, and the attractiveness of their cause. In certain cases, for example, you might have a cult that forms around the idea of, the oceans rising, and so each morning they go out and take measurements, and they hope to prove their case that the oceans are increasingly expanding, and that the lands will eventually be overtaken. Such of these cults in Nycos will actively do things to promote their position. They actively engage with opposition, both in verbal contact and quite often actually in physical conflict as well. And they tend to be fairly extreme in the viewpoint that they hold. It is, ironically, the extremism that draws people to the cults, because a group that holds a view that is easily identifiable as crazy don't necessarily build into cults, while a perfectly reasonable person who states a wacky idea, if they are charming enough and there are plenty of perks and benefits for accepting their views, will certainly draw people to them and therefore start to create the basis of a cult. Okay, so the question is asked whether or not a sect is, I'm going back to sects just in answer to this question, is a sect a special interest group? And no, sects tend to not be caring at all about what the culture believes. As a matter of fact, their beliefs can be, very simple. Like, a great example was in the history of the world, the concept of the people that were worried about the handkerchief. Early on, they were just a few, and they held a view about this white handkerchief. But over time, that sect grew, and it eventually developed in the story of that film, at least, into actually a religion. So, if you will, you could actually consider a sect to be kind of a proto-religion with an ethical basis. So, the concept of what you said about saving whales and things like that, that would apply, Dana. Whereas, now let's go, as I was saying about the cults. The cults are cults of personality, they're cults of events. They might, for example, hold that with the coming of the 12 days of never, that the world is breaking down and that it's only a matter of time until the never comes back, and therefore become harbingers of doom. The real effective power, if you will, of a cult is going to be localized. They don't tend to be able to marshal enough support to become, for example, a national interest, with one exception. For example, a religious leader or a governmental leader who himself becomes enamored of a cultish idea, if he has the acumen, the personality, the charisma, if you will, to influence larger groups, a cult can have an instantaneously huge following. This, of course, would be comparison with the here on Earth, the 9/11 crowd wanting. I'm sorry, not the 9/11 crowd. That was a misspeak. The Area 51 crowd that are going to go and raid the place. That concept is somewhat cultish because it suggests that there is a reason to go get stuff. And I suppose if an individual rose up within their ranks that took on the personality of, took on the objective, if you will, of becoming the personality, you might actually end up with a cult forming over this Area 51 nonsense. Yes, exactly, Travis. The suggestion that the Western rising sun during the 12 days of Never were supposed to be that way for the rest of time, and therefore want to go back and try to fix that. Cults, therefore, with a leader, are more effective because they are able to ignite passion and drive action, whereas those that don't have that capability, those that don't have that leadership, tend to fall to pieces fairly quickly. Furthermore, a cult can, by its own definition, be isolated. It doesn't have to have a large population group. You could feasibly be a cult of one if you resolve to take actions to accomplish whatever that cult's tactic is. When we consider the idea of cults, therefore we have to look at it from the standpoint of what kinds of things might create a cult. Well, every large and terrifying beast in the universe that has any ability to communicate, whether it be verbally or in written word or even psychically, could and more than likely does have some members of a cult following. Ancient dragons, aboleths from the oceans, the deep old ones, anything that a warlock can have as a patron. These are all fundamentally forms of cults. The idea of a warlock, or even worse, a warlock band who unify under the banner of their patron, are in effect an operational cult. Cults individually can actually be benevolent to a community if their agendas are altruistic. For example, if your cult's objective was to provide homes for the homeless, or to give a place for the Dragonborn to exist in peace. These kinds of ideas are themselves fairly benign, and even if they take on a religious connotation, they can be a positive influence on the way the world works. Some of them in Nycos get to the size of almost like international franchises that you can, as a member of the cult, get certain benefits wherever you are, certain contact tools and things like that. Some of them more benevolent, or at least the less hostile of the cults, therefore, would be, for example, thieves' guilds or assassins' guilds, or even the adventurers' guild. It's even argued that the vanguard, who have an ancient heritage, may actually be an extension of a long-lost cult from an ancient time. The real benefit to a player of being a member of a cult as compared to being a member of a sect is that your views can change. You can choose to not be the cult member forever. Maybe you actually want to redefine the cult in new terms and change the viewpoint of the leaders. This can happen in a cult, whereas the sects, by their definitions, are more set and established in their rules of engagement, so to speak. Damon has asked another really good question. In particular, he's asking about old ones. And yes, as a matter of fact, there is a growing cult of the old ones in Nycos right now. And you will not be pleased, Damon, because I know your affinity for Nycosian naval engagement. But yeah, some of the greatest and most powerful cults of the old ones are associated with also oceanic cults, because it's a great place for the old ones to hide once they get here. Not to terrify anybody who might be traveling on the oceans of Nycos, but, well, there it is. Now, when we talk about the idea of cults, before we move on to the third, we need to talk about the fact that there are benefits in character play for each of these groups. So let me back up for a second. Let's go ahead and go on with the third. I'm short-circuiting myself. Let's go on with the third, which is secret societies. And secret societies are arguably the most volatile, least stable, and potentially the most dangerous form of social groupings in Nycos. Secret societies generally only have to exist if there is exactly one secret or more. In other words, you could have as a secret that there are no secrets, and that can become, if you will, a form of cult, a form of secret society. Because there will be other people you will run into in-game or in different cities on Nycos who also hold that view. And once you have connections with secret societies, the biggest danger of them is that they depend on their membership far more than the other two. A cult has an agenda, it has a group of people for a limited time, and when those purposes fall out of favor, the cults will dissolve. In the case of sects, they only exist for that one agenda, for that one purpose, and if it falls out of favor or is accomplished or somehow else is taken off the table, the sects will dissolve. But secret societies, they can last fundamentally forever because they exist in more cases than not through the written word. Much of the lore of Nycos is hidden in documents written by various secret societies or for their purposes, and therefore are in various encryption codes, different writing styles, odd languages, not to mention actual cryptics, but cryptology. But the basic fear that drives secret societies is that information will get lost, and therefore they can only be trusted to certain people. So, like the fish could be sort of a cult of the old ones. That's the question, and I think I just kind of answered it with the tone on which I took. Fish are an interesting sect-gen race. They were created in the second Genesis for the purposes of communicating with some intelligences in the ocean, but I won't go into the details of whom they were or anything like that, because that would be far too much of a spoiler. Let's just say some fish can be cultists. And they could also be members of secret societies if they can get to the second thing you have to have for secret societies, and that is, beyond having a secret, you have to have a society. You have to have a cultural group of interracial and interspecies population wherein the ideas of secrecy can be made pretty clear. In other words, if you are a member of an order that doesn't care for the sect gen, then that would be a real trigger for you. You'd find people in the area who were not sect gen and they could join your society, whereas those that were unfortunate enough to be in your mind's eye sect gen, whether that be the Tarmakians or Lacertines or even the Fish, you wouldn't even invite them to your secret society. So obviously there can be as many secret societies as there are peoples on Nycos, and that can itself be kind of daunting to think that around every corner is somebody who's spying on you for their society or their order. But the one thing to remember throughout this is that secret societies, although they are technically the most dangerous, are also the most mercurial. There can be, for example, yellow veil societies and orange veil societies, even though they don't tend to stick together for very long. Yes, that would be a question for a session there, Damonith. So definitely you'll want to make sure you attend the games that you can. This is a quick note in the middle of this. I am broadcasting this from Gameology, the best game store in Southern California. One reason of which is they have this really cool space that I can rent to do my videos and run my private games, and you can rent the space too. Just contact the store and coordinate for that. The link is down at the logo down below. But I digress. Anyway, the secret societies, therefore, being mercurial means that they can last for a short period of time or they can last forever. They can be lawful. They're rarely chaotic. But ironically enough, the chaotic ones can be the most dangerous because they try to find ways to leave information for others to find that is less secret and more grand conspiracy in nature. So secret societies of the old ones would be lawful because they try to understand the way the old ones think, but there also would be chaotic members trying to short circuit the system and bring the old ones to Nycos directly. So now we're coming down to the last part of this. I've got a few more minutes here. I would like to go over the benefits, if you will, of secret societies, cults, and sects in Nycos. We're going to go with the sects first. Since many of them are religious in order, often you can be of a various clerical race and get contact information into communities that you may not otherwise have by becoming members of a specific sect. Furthermore, sects tend to have more specific information than general religious worshippers about the very basis of faith. And so by joining a particular sect, or at least entertaining the thoughts of a particular sect, you can get new insight into the world and how the various cultures you're involved with can enact. Ironically enough, and I keep using that word, I just figured out a new word for that. Those of you who are subscribers to this channel on Twitch and also are teammates through the Patreon, you have the opportunity to actually influence the story by being members of the individual sects that are associated with the Veils. More information will be given about this in the next Nycos Insider episode, which will be coming up later this week. I'll have to get on the dates on that. But the idea of being a member of a sect means you get certain informational tools and access. You may even end up with some additional written or visual materials that others don't get. So joining a sect is not necessarily a bad thing. Now, as far as cults are concerned, cults, generally speaking, are all bad. There may be one or two instances where you'll run into a cult that is particularly benevolent that you could, for example, donate your cash to in the story, or could incorporate into your planning to infiltrate a cult and things like that, because they generally are great sources for information, but tend to be pretty awful when it comes to being good for your character's social or actual life. The next part are, well, we're talking about cults, and joining a cult in Nycos generally will get your character into a bad state with the other players in the group, because cults generally are pretty controlling. Red Veil, you would think, would be a huge cult. They like to think of themselves as a religion. I'm certain there are other people in this audience, whether they're in this viewing now or viewing later, that'll think that the Red Veil is clearly, at least in some places, established as a cult. But the one thing that is the easiest to become a part of and most likely to influence the game are ironically the hardest to find, and those are the secret societies. These are, when you do succeed in finding and connecting with a secret society, this does give you the straight dope on some part of the story that you may not have had otherwise. They also tend to be able to give you a leg up in places you wouldn't expect, because while membership is secret, the higher level members are aware of the lower level members' status, and so players might find themselves getting sudden strange bedfellows as assistants during a game if they have joined one or more of the secret societies within the game. Members can actually actively recruit for and gain benefit from bringing additional members as well, such as in the Tet cult in Fulcrum, which is Whispers in the Mists. If you guys want to watch that, the show has one secret society has already been involved with the story. Let's see. Yes, and the essence of a secret society is that keeping the secret is more important than actually succeeding in some kind of a mission. It's a matter of writing it all down and being aware of it and not necessarily sharing it with others. That fundamentally is what defines a secret society. You let the people in that you think will help you, but you don't necessarily give them enough information to make them an inner circle member of your society, unless of course your society is also expanding to new areas where they can become a part. Well, with saying all this about Nycos and secret societies and sects and cults, I also want to say that generally speaking, the governments of the various nations of Nycos are directly altruistic. They truly are trying their best to govern their people. While there are some that fall short of that goal or become arguably manipulative in the process, they are not, by definition, trying to harm the people in their country. Now, there will be times, for example, that cults will take over in a certain area, and that cult will influence the leaders to do bad things. And there can be areas even where religious orders have ascended to the level of cult by establishing in a particular area a mortal leader. But that is not the norm for nations in Nycos. So watch for that in the storytelling. You'll notice that the influences of secret societies will become evident only if the players pursue connections with those cult members. Some of you may remember that, for example, Bathra in Winds of the West was looking at becoming a member of the X Guild and did a couple of things for them, and in the process got his companion fundamentally killed and then forced into a mystical item. Very bad thing. But let's see. Yes, yes. Remember those kind of things, Travis Damon. You definitely will be running into more of that in the near future, I think. But as we get ready to close out this episode, I want to thank you for the time you spent with me going over the various sects, cults, and secret societies of Nycos. We'll go into more individual details when I get to the nation by nation sections of this series. So for today, this is Jonathan Albin, the Game Market Guru with Nycos Insiders. You guys have a great day.